Snow pressed against the valley floor like a sheet tucked tight over a corpse. The wind moaned through bare oaks, carrying a scent of cold pine and frozen earth. Smoke from a few scattered chimneys twisted upward, gray as ash. Silence had weight here, and it bore a history that no one spoke aloud. Letters went missing, women went missing, and the hollow, dark and patient, waited. I first noticed it in the ledger. 5 letters stacked in the unclaimed slot, a trunk logged months before, and the faint, terrible trace of absence trailing through the town's record books. One schoolteacher had disappeared in October before the first frost, and nothing in the official minutes acknowledged her vanishing. Just absence, hollow space, quiet, welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. I am Elias Thorne, Cedar Ridge Postmaster, age 61, and the man who keeps accounts others do not. My fingers have traced every stamp and scroll since 1883, and in my careful ledger, I notice patterns that men prefer to ignore. December of 1901 brought me 7 letters addressed to Miss Lenora Baird, a teacher assigned to the one-room schoolhouse at Hollow Creek, 5 miles from town along a road no one traveled lightly. The wagon had delivered her just after dawn, cheerful letters tucked beneath her arm, and by nightfall, she had vanished. 7 letters now sat in my post office unclaimed, snow piling against the windows, the town quiet under winter's weight. I pulled the ledger from its shelf and ran my finger down the October pages. October 12th. Lenora Baird, 1 trunk, 1 carpetbag, delivered to Callaway Farm, Hollow Creek Road. I remembered the day precisely. The driver, a stout man named Grady, spoke of leaving a young woman at a cabin along the main road. I assumed she would continue to the schoolhouse alone, but the school board minutes of the 13th told another story. The post remained vacant, no applicant arrived. Recommendation, repost in Springfield. The ledger and the minutes agreed. Lenora Baird had arrived at the Callaway property, and she did not leave. I had known the Callaway brothers only in passing. Elias Callaway, 48, thin, careful, polite. Thaddeus Callaway, 44, larger, silent, steady. Traders of furs, merchants of hides, known for paying exact coin without speaking beyond necessity. Their cabin sat 5 miles up Hollow Creek Road, isolated, set back from the main route with no neighbors for miles. I had assumed them harmless because the town did not speak of them. I had assumed the quiet of the hollow was just that. Until now, hours passed as I traced back through older ledgers. My lamp burned low, shadows lengthening across walls lined with years of record books. Each name I wrote on a clean sheet of paper carried weight. Sarah Dunlop, 1896. A young teacher from Kansas City, root care of Callaway Farm. Letters ceased after 3 weeks. Constance Hadley, 1898, governess employed at a nearby estate, root care of Callaway Farm. Last confirmed correspondence June. Josephine Dale, 1899, traveling nurse, root care of Callaway Farm. Inquiry received in October, no resolution. Margaret Frost, 1900, governess and tutor, root care of Callaway Farm. Last letter October. And now, Lenora Baird, 1901 schoolteacher, vanished October. 5 women in 6 years, all traveling alone, all rooted care of Callaway Farm, all disappeared without explanation, without town gossip, without question. The post office felt smaller as I read the names aloud to myself, each syllable a pulse of horror. The snow outside pressed against the window, still and gray. I folded the sheet and placed it in my coat pocket. By first light, I would ride to the sheriff, alone if necessary, and demand answers. The sheriff of Cedar Ridge, a heavy man named Gideon Pruitt, 56, had held office for 20 years by avoiding trouble. He did not seek it. He tolerated it if it could be ignored. He listened to my report of the names, dates, deliveries, and absences with his jaw working a piece of tobacco. When I finished, he shrugged. "Women leave sometimes," he said, voice flat. "Homesick, scared, found a husband. You don't have bodies, witnesses, or confessions. Patterns aren't proof." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "The Callaway brothers have been here longer than you've been alive. You expect me to ride 5 miles up Hollow Creek on a hunch?" I left his office knowing what he had said was law but not truth. He would not act. The weight of that certainty settled over me like winter frost. I returned to the post office, snow crunching under boots, breath clouding in the gray air. The 7 letters to Lenora Baird sat there, patient, waiting. Her last letter to her family lay folded in my coat pocket, full of hope and faith that the world was fundamentally safe, and yet she had vanished into the hollow like a shadow swallowed by darkness. For 3 nights, I observed the Calloway property from the ridge above their cabin. Moonlight caught the thin curl of smoke from the chimney, the sharp angles of the barn. The yard was empty, silent, no sign of life beyond their occasional trips to the town's general store. One night, past midnight, I saw lamplight flicker in the barn. A scraping sound followed, metal against frozen earth, deliberate and wrong. I held my breath and watched until the flame vanished, the barn swallowed again by night. Winter hardened the hollow, froze the roads, and brought silence to Cedar Ridge. The law would not move. So I resolved that I would. I gathered my revolver, a borrowed mare, and the strength I had learned on battlefields long ago. If the world would not answer for Lenora Baird, I would carry her past silence myself. I rode before dawn on the morning of January 3, 1902, along the frozen Hollow Creek Road. The cold burned my lungs, my hands numbed in leather gloves. I dismounted when the ridge thinned, tied the mare to a pine far from the cabin site, and moved forward on foot. The wind cut through me, carrying the scent of frost and pine, and in that silence, I felt the hollow watching. The Calloway cabin sat low, built to disappear, as if the earth itself had swallowed it. To the left, the barn leaned gray and weathered, door half open. Beyond, a line of traps glinted dull in the morning light. The property was meticulous, orderly. No sign of women, no sign of life beyond the brothers. It was the work of men who lived by their own rules. I approached the cabin. Elias Calloway stepped out first, thin and pale, eyes sharp as creek water, voice smooth and slow, words carefully measured. Thaddeus Calloway appeared behind him, broad, silent, watching. I introduced myself and asked about Lenora Baird, describing her arrival and the delivery route. Elias's eyes did not blink, his face unreadable, his voice calm. "I have never seen the woman," he said. "You must be mistaken. No one has arrived here. The road is quiet, you misremember." I pointed to the 3 women's coats hanging inside the cabin, heavy wool of varying colors, the kind travelers carried. Elias's face remained neutral. "They belong to my mother," he said. "Dead 10 years, wool lasts, waste is a sin." I asked to see the barn. Elias hesitated only a moment before nodding, calling over his shoulder. Thaddeus stepped into the doorway, silent and massive, a wall of muscle and stillness, while Elias led me across the yard. Inside, the air smelled of leather, blood, and curing pelts. Traps hung on hooks, bundles of furs stacked in corners. Everything had a place. Everything spoke of men who understood order. In a shadowed corner, half hidden in straw, I saw a trunk caked with mud, brass fittings dulled with age. I crouched and read the initials worn smooth but legible, LB. I turned to Elias. "I believe this belongs to the missing schoolteacher," I said. "I bought it from a peddler last month," he replied. "Paid $2, no questions asked. Good trun. K is good trunk. I warned him I would bring deputies." Elias nodded calmly, saying honest men have nothing to hide. Thaddeus stepped forward then, filling the doorway, voice grinding like stones. "You calling us liars?" I said nothing, only that lies had a way of surfacing when the digging started. Then I left, heart hammering, the brothers' eyes following me across the snowed road. By the time I returned to town, the sun had set and the cold deepened. I knew with certainty Lenora Baird was dead. Her death was neither quick nor kind, and the men responsible slept warm while the county looked away. I spent the next 3 days at the post office after hours, tracing ledgers, deliveries, and correspondence back to 1895. 5 women, 8 years, all routed care of Calloway Farm. Each vanished, correspondence ending as if stepping off the edge of the known world. By the end, I had a chart that proved, morally if not legally, that action was required. I presented it to the general store clerk, then to Sheriff Pruitt. Both turned away. The law had chosen silence. And so I prepared myself. The hollow waited, the letters waited, and I would not. The ridge above the Calloway cabin was silent except for the wind whipping through the bare oaks. I tied the mare to a stout pine, crouched low and moved closer on foot. The cold bit through my gloves and the snow crunched under my boots, but each step was deliberate, measured, precise. Years on battlefields taught me that panic could kill faster than bullets, and tonight I needed every ounce of control I could muster. The cabin loomed ahead, low and shadowed, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. I could see lamplight flicker from behind the chinking, and beneath it, the barn sat dark and still. Something stirred in the hollow, just beyond sight. My breath came in clouds. My fingers tightened around the revolver, the metal familiar and heavy. I crept toward the barn first. The door hung slightly open, old wood groaning as the wind pushed against it. Inside, the smell of leather and cured furs hit me, sharp and pungent. Every bundle was stacked neatly, every trap in its place, but in the farthest corner, half hidden beneath straw, something made me pause. A mound of earth had been disturbed recently, fresh soil pushed aside, forming a shallow depression that my instincts recognized instantly. My heart thundered. I knelt beside it and brushed away the loose dirt with gloved hands. Beneath it, a wooden well cover had been recently nailed in place, fresh planks pale against the old wood of the barn floor. I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence. Absolute silence, thick and oppressive. My stomach turned over. I knew what was beneath. I straightened and stepped back, scanning the yard. Elias and Thaddeus Calloway were inside, voices low, muffled through the walls. "He's come alone," I heard Thaddeus say. His voice was flat, like stone scraping over stone. "Let him try," Elias replied. "No law touches us here. 8 years and no one has stopped us yet." I backed away from the barn, each movement deliberate. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I kept it at bay. The mare was waiting. I untied her, swung into the saddle and rode back toward town, feeling their eyes on me the entire way, certain, confident, untouchable. By dawn, I reached Cedar Ridge and went straight to Jacob Marsh, a laborer I trusted. His hands were rough, and his back was strong. He asked few questions, and when I explained the situation, well, the truth really, he agreed to help. Breakfast first, cold biscuits eaten silently, then we rode back to the hollow with a crowbar, and the single-minded focus that only men with experience in hard, unpleasant work understand. The property was deserted, smoke gone, door latched, barn empty. Winter had stiffened everything, but the well waited. Together we lifted the cap, the stakes grating under our efforts, the wood finally giving way to darkness beneath. The stench rose. Instantly, the air thick with decay and something sweeter, fouler, impossible to name. Jacob gagged, stumbled back into the snow, but I held my ground. A match struck, flame revealing stone walls descending 15 feet into darkness, and there, through a thin layer of white powder, cloth, tattered, rotted, but unmistakable. Human remains, arranged as if buried to hide the horror, yet betrayed by every instinct. I replaced the cap carefully, giving Jacob instructions to ride for the sheriff and deputies, and waited alone. The cold settled into my bones, but I did not shiver. Not now. Not when I had seen proof. Not when I had finally found what the law refused to acknowledge. Sheriff Pruitt arrived, reluctant and pale, with 2 deputies. I guided him to the well, and when he looked down, his face went the color of old wax. Orders came slow, careful, hesitant. We would need proper tools. Coroner, a wagon for the bodies. The Calloway cabin was empty, all traces gone, every coat, every trunk removed, every sign of occupation vanished, except the well itself. Too large to hide, too deep to empty overnight. Warrants were posted. Calls went out to neighboring counties. Virgil and Thaddeus Calloway, wanted for suspicion of murder, armed and dangerous. But they had a head start, and the wilderness was familiar to them. For 3 weeks, the only news was false sightings and rumors, until a trapper named Goss found them 20 miles north of Hollow Creek, frozen in a limestone cave. The winter had caught them, exposed and unprepared. No fire, no provisions, no escape from the cold that would claim them in hours. I rode with Jacob to the cave, arriving before the coroner. They lay curled against the stone walls, hands locked in claws, faces blue and expressionless. Around them, scattered across frost and rock, were items that made my heart both ache and harden. A cameo brooch, a silver ring, Lenora Baird's, confirmed later by her father, letters, tied in bundles, sent from women who would never see their families again, and a leather journal, Virgil Calloway's careful, precise handwriting tracing every crime. I read the journal by lamplight while the sheriff watched, hands shaking slightly. Dates and names went back to 1894, 2 years before I had traced in my ledgers, 8 women, not 5. Every entry clinical, noting arrival, duration, and disposal. Sarah Dunlop, 23, resisted. Disposed October 1896. Constance Hadley, 19, compliant. Disposed June 1898. Josephine Dale, 25, traveling nurse. Disposed October 1899. Margaret Frost, 22, disposed October 1900. Lenora Baird, 24, fought until the end, buried deep, will not surface. Each life reduced to a transaction, recorded with the cold efficiency of a grocery receipt. The sheriff stood outside the cave, white-faced and trembling. The journal alone would close 8 cases, 8 families, shattered, finally accounted for. Justice, however delayed, had arrived in the form of frost and stone. The well at the Calloway property was excavated in February. 5 sets of remains were recovered, catalogued, and returned to their families. Services were held, silent and sorrowful, in the Methodist Church, while I, postmaster and witness, attended each one. Lenora Baird's father shook my hand at the close of her service, eyes wet, voice trembling. "Thank you for not looking away," he said, "for keeping their names, for following them into the dark." In March, the county burned the Calloway property to the ground. Furniture, traps, every stick of timber doused in lamp oil and consumed by flame. Health regulations, the county said, but the truth was deeper. Erasure, cleansing. Fire did what law could not. The hollow, poisoned by evil, was purified in flame. I remained postmaster until my death in 1911, 71 years old. I never married. I never spoke publicly of the Calloway case except when duty required. On the day the property burned, I wrote one final entry in my personal journal, "Case closed. J. Eustace served. Let the record stand. Evil hides in quiet places, but the land remembers, and someone is always keeping the books." Winter's grip lingered over the hollow long after the property burned. Snow drifted over the ruins, and the trees grew thick with frost, hiding the scars of what had happened there. People in town spoke of the Calloway brothers only in whispers, as if mentioning their names aloud could summon the ghosts of the women who had vanished. Children were warned to stay away from the hollow, not with stories of monsters, but with an unspoken fear, the kind that lives in the edges of memory and turns curiosity into caution. I returned to my post office each day, moving through the motions of delivering letters and sorting packages, but nothing felt routine anymore. Each envelope reminded me of those who had vanished, each stamp a witness to the passage of time and the indifference of the world. I kept my journal open on the counter, entries neat, dated, and unyielding. Every name counted, every date verified. The ledger of lives that had been ignored was now my responsibility. Some nights I rode back toward the hollow, alone, checking the perimeter, ensuring that nothing had returned, that the land remained quiet, still and free from the footsteps of those who had once ruled it with fear. I did not fear the brothers anymore. They were frozen in their cave, but I feared the silence that allowed men like them to exist at all. That fear sharpened my senses, kept me awake in the dark hours, and reminded me why keeping the books mattered. Spring arrived with a slow thaw, melting snow into the frozen earth. The hollow became a mess of mud and broken branches, the air filled with the smell of wet soil and new growth. I rode past the ruins one morning and saw a fox sniffing among the ashes, its coat the color of rust and smoke. Life continued despite the evil that had once thrived there, but the memory of the 8 women lingered in the hollow like a shadow that refused to be erased. Families wrote to thank me, to offer condolences, and to send news of the women's funerals and burials. Some letters arrived months later, bearing photographs of graves newly marked with flowers and simple stones. I filed each one carefully, as if the act of keeping their correspondence preserved more than memory. It preserved acknowledgement. Each letter, each photograph, was proof that those women had existed, that they had mattered, and that their absence would not go uncounted. Sometimes I thought about the men who had ignored the patterns, the sheriff who had shrugged and looked away, the townspeople who had whispered and turned their faces. I remembered the first day I saw the stack of unclaimed letters for Ada Kern, the first time I understood that something was wrong, that evil could hide in plain sight. Those who looked away had made my work harder, but they had also made the success of justice, however delayed, all the more necessary. By midsummer, the hollow had begun to heal. Young saplings grew where the cabins once stood, and the smell of pine and damp earth replaced the odor of decay. Travelers passed nearby without knowing what had happened, their horses and wagons leaving tracks that blurred and vanished in the rain. And yet, beneath the new growth, the land remembered. It held the secret of the well, the hidden graves, the journal, and the jewelry, silent witnesses to the horror that had taken place. I continued my work at the post office, every day the same routine, but my eyes were always sharper, my mind always alert. Each time a woman traveled alone through the valley, I thought of the Calloway brothers, of the well, and of the women whose letters never reached home. I watched the mail, tracked deliveries, and noticed patterns others would dismiss. I was the keeper of records, the guardian of absence, the man who would not let silence swallow the truth. And still, some nights, I dreamed of the hollow. I saw the lamplight flickering behind the logs, the shadows moving with intent, and the women's faces pressed against the walls of my mind. I heard their voices, soft at first, then rising, asking to be counted, asking to be remembered. I woke with my hand on the ledger, pen in place, recording details, tracing names, making sure the story of their lives and deaths was never lost to the quiet of the mountains. I knew the law had limits. It had delayed action, ignored evidence, and allowed evil to thrive, but I also knew that duty could not be postponed. Duty did not wait for permission. Duty did not heed convenience or fear. It demanded action, even when no one else would act. And so I kept the books. I traced the letters. I recorded the evidence. I followed the patterns others would not see. I did not forgive, nor did I forget. The hollow faded behind me as the seasons passed, but it remained alive in memory, in ledger pages, and in the quiet, deliberate work of recording names, dates, and deliveries. I was a postmaster, yes, but more than that, I was a witness, a chronicler, a man who bore the weight of absence. Every envelope, every stamp, every signature mattered, every woman counted. And when the world chose to look away, I looked closer, leaned in, and refused to let the hollow keep its secrets. Years later, when I grew older and my hands began to tremble, I trained my successor at the post office, teaching him the importance of noticing details, of reading absences as carefully as presences, of valuing each life as something more than a transaction. He learned the routines, the cataloging, the recording, but I suspect he never fully understood the weight of what I had carried alone, the knowledge of what had been hidden in the hollow, the faces and names that haunted the ledger, the lives reduced to numbers and dates. I never married, never had children, never sought recognition. My work was not for fame or reward, it was for justice in its purest, quietest form. When the land remembered, when the families finally knew what had happened to their daughters, sisters, and wives, I knew that the ledger had fulfilled its purpose. The record stood, even if the law had delayed, even if the world had looked away, and when my time came, I left the ledger open on the post office counter, pen at rest, entries complete. The hollow was empty, the wells covered, the ashes cold, but the names remained, inked on paper, counted, and remembered. Evil had visited the valley and been punished by frost and fire, and I had ensured that the world would not forget those who had suffered quietly, whose lives had been stolen, whose voices had been silenced. The mountains still hold the hollow, and the valley still remembers. Travelers pass without knowledge, children play unaware, but the record stands, the names are kept, the letters are logged, the memory endures, and I, Silus Webb, remain the witness who would not look away. The years passed quietly, and the hollow receded from the minds of most townspeople, but I never let it recede from mine. Each day at the post office I handled letters with the same careful attention, as if every envelope could be another life depending on me to see it through. I watched travelers come and go, marking the ones who carried themselves alone, who trusted strangers, and noting patterns in the back of my mind. I was a man marked by what I had seen, and nothing could return me to the ignorance of youth. Sometimes, on the rare occasions when I rode past the hollow in daylight, I saw signs of new life pushing through the decay. Saplings and vines grew where cabins and barns once stood. Birds nested in the broken rafters. The snowmelt filled small pools in the depressions left by the earthworks. It was a slow reclamation, a quiet healing. But even as nature claimed the space, the memory of what had occurred remained. The land itself seemed to remember, as if holding vigil over the women whose lives had been stolen. And the evil that had flourished there. At night, when the post office was locked and the lamps dimmed, I sometimes traced the routes the women had taken, imagining their steps, their hope, their trust, and the sudden collapse into horror. I wrote letters I would never send, documenting what they might have wished to leave behind, trying to breathe some measure of life into the silence that had once swallowed them. Every name I wrote was a resistance, a refusal to let the hollow claim them entirely. Occasionally, strangers came into town asking questions, people who had heard stories from distant relatives or travelers who whispered of vanished women in the Ozarks. I answered carefully, giving details only when necessary, preserving the memory while protecting the fragile sense of order in the valley. Too much revelation might reopen old wounds, but too little allowed forgetting to creep in. It was a balance I carried alone, as silently as the ledger I kept. I often thought of the Mlin brothers, of their calculated cruelty, and of the strange efficiency with which they had executed years of horrors. I thought about the journal I had found in the cave, the meticulous records of arrivals and disappearances, the mechanical precision of their crimes. Evil, I realized, often works not through force or spectacle, but through patience, calculation, and the willful blindness of those around it. The law could be slow, and communities could be complacent, but the ledger never forgets. By the time I grew into my late 60s, I had trained my apprentice to take over the daily operations of the post office, though I still supervised every ledger, every signature, every route. I was old and weary, but my vigilance never waned. Letters continued to arrive for those who were gone, long-delayed messages, misdirected notes, and correspondence from distant family. Each one became a reminder of duty unfulfilled, of lives interrupted, and of the quiet justice I had wrought against the silence that had once swallowed them. I often reflected on the paradox of justice in the valley. The law had failed, delayed, and ignored. The sheriff had shrugged, the townspeople had looked away, and the Mlin brothers had escaped human punishment, only to be judged by frost and the unforgiving winter. In that, there was a lesson. The world does not always enforce morality, but the consequences of evil are unavoidable, sometimes delivered by the very land that bore witness. The law is imperfect, but observation, record, and memory endure. Late at night, I sometimes heard the hollow calling in my dreams. I walked its darkened trails with a lantern, imagining the women who had vanished, their faces obscured by shadow yet etched in memory. I spoke their names quietly, counting them aloud as one might pray. Sarah Dill, Constance Healy, Josephine Dale, Margaret Frost, Ada Kern. And then 3 more, unknown to most but known to me, the women who had arrived earlier before I began tracing the pattern, whose letters and deliveries were lost to time but whose presence I honored in my journals. Each name was a life reclaimed from the hollow, a story preserved against forgetting. In my final years, I continued to write, each entry in the journal an extension of the ledger. I chronicled not only the mail and arrivals, but also patterns, absences, and the faint traces of human behavior that might otherwise escape notice. The valley had its rhythms, its silence, and its secrets, and it was my duty to note them all, to ensure that evil could never thrive unnoticed again. The ledger became more than a tool. It became a record of vigilance, a shield against forgetting, a testament to the lives that had been taken and the justice that had been quietly delivered. When I died in 1911, I left everything carefully organized. My journals, ledgers, letters, and notes were preserved as evidence of observation, dedication, and moral duty. Those who found them would understand this. At the work of keeping the books is more than clerical. It is ethical, historical, and sacred. Each name mattered, each date was a witness, and each absence was a testament to the necessity of seeing what others ignore. The hollow remains to this day, overgrown with trees and brush, its earth soft and unmarked by new construction. Travelers pass nearby, Unaware of the tragedies buried beneath the soil, the valley remembers, as do I, even in absence, and the record stands as a warning. Evil often hides quietly, patiently, waiting for silence and complacency to shield it. But when someone is willing to keep the books, to notice patterns, to observe absences, justice, though delayed, will always find a way. And so I write, I record, and I bear witness. The ledger is complete, yet the vigilance remains. The hollow is quiet, but it is never empty. The women are counted, their lives acknowledged, and their memory preserved. In the end, the law may have faltered, the community may have looked away, but I did not. I saw, I recorded, and I ensured that their absence would never be forgotten. The weeks following the discovery in the well brought a grim clarity to my understanding of the Mlin brothers and their operations. I returned daily to the post office, poring over the ledgers and journals I had rescued from the cave. The entries in Virgil's hand were systematic, almost surgical, cataloging arrivals, dispositions, and the smallest details of the women who had vanished under their roof. It was a ledger of horror, clinical in its detachment, and yet human in its concern for order, as if they were conducting an experiment rather than committing murder. I began cross-referencing these records with the town archives, the school board minutes, and the scattered correspondence of families. The patterns were undeniable. Every woman who had passed through Piney Hollow had been isolated, routed to the Mlin property, and then vanished without witness. I compiled the data into charts, noting arrival dates, professions, ages, and the intervals between disappearance and inquiry. 5 women over 8 years, now 8 in total once Virgil's full journal was accounted for, each carefully logged, each disposed of as if they were objects rather than living, breathing people. It was in the methodical nature of these crimes that the horror crystallized. They were not driven by impulse but by a perverse sense of duty to their own rules. The ledger became both their justification and their record, a moral ledger in which every victim was accounted for and every act rationalized as necessary. It was a form of twisted science, an application of cold logic to the warm and fragile lives of others. I felt a chill every time I traced their entries: compliant, resistant, length of time, disposal method. Each notation was precise, unemotional, and final. I visited the families who had lost daughters, wives, and sisters, bringing the evidence I had gathered. Some refused to believe it. Some wept, and some, silently nodding, understood the truth that had eluded the law for so long. Each encounter reminded me of the personal cost of the Mlin brothers' meticulous cruelty. The ledger had preserved the moral reality of their crimes, but it could not undo the absence nor restore the stolen lives. Still, it was all I had. The coroner's reports from the recovered remains provided further grim detail. Cause of death in each case varied, but all were the result of confinement, exposure, or violent subjugation. Time of death was estimated with remarkable accuracy, based on decomposition and residual effects of cold, lime, and soil. Each report added a layer to the historical record, a reinforcement of the ledger's precision. The Mlin brothers had been methodical. I could only follow their traces, reconstructing the horrors they had enacted, but never undoing them. I also began to examine the tools and implements found in the cabin and barn: traps, ropes, and devices, or restraint. They were organized, sharpened, and maintained with care. It was not enough that they killed. They maintained the instruments of their craft as a craftsman maintains a trade. I sketched each piece, noting materials, wear, and evidence of use. Even in death, the objects spoke of intent and premeditation, and of the cold calculation that had allowed them to evade discovery for so long. In studying the journal further, I noticed small details that spoke to a shared pathology, a fascination with dominance and compliance, a meticulous interest in anatomical weakness, a record of resistance overcome. They wrote of the women's strength and defiance, noting which methods of restraint succeeded most efficiently, which strategies elicited compliance fastest, and which failed. It read like a clinical study, a perverse compendium of human behavior under duress. And yet it was not abstract. Every experiment was a life, every data point a soul snatched from the world. I documented these findings with care. Every note was preserved in my personal journal, separate from the postal ledger as a moral accounting. I recorded the techniques, the timing, the logistics of the Mlin property, the isolation, the hollow's geography, the supply routes. All of these were relevant not only to understanding the crimes, but also to ensuring that, should anyone else attempt similar acts, the patterns would be recognizable and the perpetrators could be caught before another life was taken. Observation, documentation, and knowledge were now my weapons. One night, I revisited the hollow under the pale light of a waning moon. The snow had melted enough to reveal the uneven paths, the depressions where wagons had once turned, and the subtle, almost invisible traces of human passage. I walked slowly, noting how the brothers might have moved, how the women might have been led, and where they might have resisted. The physical geography of evil was precise, and the lessons of the land were evident. Isolation, concealment, and proximity to natural barriers made detection nearly impossible. The hollow itself was complicit, its shadows and thickets providing cover for the crimes that had been committed. Returning to the post office, I began compiling a dossier of evidence and observations. This included ledger entries, journal transcripts, letters from families, coroner reports, sketches of implements, and my own notes on the geography of Piney Hollow. Every item was categorized and cross-referenced. It was an archive of evil, but also a record of resistance, the knowledge that the pattern could be traced, remembered, and ultimately brought to light. In those weeks, I also revisited the people who had witnessed aspects of the Mlin brothers' daily life. Petty at the general store, Cobb the farmer, and the wagon driver Hooper were all questioned again, carefully and respectfully. Each recollection added fragments to the understanding of the brothers' operations, the purchases of rope, of heavy blankets, of barrels that never reached normal use. All of it contributed to the larger pattern. I wrote their statements verbatim, noting hesitation, tone, and emphasis, knowing that these small human details were essential in reconstructing a reality that had once been denied. Even as I worked, I felt the weight of time pressing down. The brothers had acted over 8 years, yet the consequences of their actions persisted beyond the reach of the law. Families remained bereft, the land was haunted by absence, and the town had preferred ignorance to knowledge. I understood now the depth of silence that allowed such horrors to fester. Observation, record-keeping, and moral vigilance were no longer abstract duties. They were necessary acts of justice, an attempt to restore balance in a world where the legal system had failed. I did not hesitate when the first clear signs of spring arrived. The thaw revealed more than just earth. It revealed hidden traces, depressions where earth had been moved, fragments of bone washed out by melting snow, and traces of tools left behind. I catalogued each find, marking locations on a hand-drawn map, noting depth, soil type, and proximity to structures. Every anomaly was a clue, every shadow a potential testimony. The landscape itself, I realized, could bear witness when human memory faltered. By March, I had completed my initial survey of the property and collated all observations into a cohesive narrative. I presented the findings to the sheriff once again, this time with undeniable evidence, ledger entries, journal pages, letters, coroner reports, and photographs of the remains and implements. Hayes examined the collection with a mixture of disbelief and resignation, recognizing finally the scale and method of the crimes. He admitted that the case would have been unsolvable without my persistence and the thorough record-keeping I had maintained over the years. Yet even in this vindication, there as no triumph, the horror of what had been done, the meticulous cruelty of the brothers, and the unheeded suffering of the women left a bitter residue. Justice had arrived late, through frost and time rather than the law, and the moral weight of 8 lost lives remained with me. My role as observer and chronicler had been necessary, but it could not restore what was stolen. I continued my documentation, aware that memory, record, and vigilance were the only defenses against the recurrence of such darkness. In this period, I also began to understand the broader implications of hereditary influence, isolation, and familial pathology in Piney Hollow. The brothers had grown up within an insular environment, a lineage marked by silence, secrecy, and rigid codes of conduct. Their upbringing, coupled with the isolation of the Hollow, had fostered a moral framework entirely divorced from communal norms. In studying this, I noted the subtle but unmistakable patterns of inherited behavior. Cruelty, meticulousness, and a compulsion to catalogue, all manifesting in perverse forms. It was a chilling study in the confluence of environment and heredity, and one I recorded with the care of a naturalist observing a dangerous species. By the end of Part 5, I had constructed a detailed, interconnected account of the Mlin brothers' actions, the women they lured, the methods of isolation, the tools and devices, the ledger entries, and the geography of the hollow. I had also begun to consider preventive measures, documenting the patterns for future postal clerks, sharing warnings discreetly with authorities, and ensuring that the knowledge of such horrors remained accessible should darkness ever return to the Ozarks. The ledger had become more than a record, it had become a shield. Spring settled slowly over Howell County, the snow retreating into memory, and with it the sharp edges of winter's clarity. The Mlin property had been thoroughly excavated and burned, yet the hollow remained, silent and unyielding, a natural tomb that absorbed the echoes of what had transpired. I returned often, not as a pursuer, but as a chronicler, tracing the hollow's contours, noting the signs that remained. Even in desolation, there were subtle traces, depressions in the soil, tufts of grass growing in unnatural patterns where the earth had been disturbed, and small fragments of bone that escaped even the most thorough excavation. Nature had reclaimed much, but memory clings, and the hollow had a way of remembering everything. The families of the victims began to find a semblance of closure, though it was bitter. Some held private services, others marked graves with small stones or carved crosses, and a few left no markers at all, content with the knowledge that the truth had finally emerged. I attended where I could, keeping to the shadows, silent in the back of the churches, listening to the words of comfort and grief, and noting the ways people struggled to reconcile the scale of the crimes with the ordinariness of their neighbors. It was impossible, almost, to understand how evil could thrive unnoticed for so long. In the post office, the work continued, but with a heightened sense of purpose. I kept my ledgers meticulously, noting not just deliveries and receipts, but patterns, anomalies, and absences. Every new arrival, every traveler passing through the county, became a point of observation. The Mlin case had shown me that vigilance was a duty in itself, that small oversights could allow calamity to flourish unchecked. The ledger, once merely a record of transactions, had become an instrument of moral defense, a tool for recognizing the subtle signs of danger before it could manifest. Occasionally strangers passed through town, and I observed them carefully. Some were travelers moving with purpose, while others lingered, their eyes roving and assessing, their movements deliberate. The lessons of Piney Hollow guided my scrutiny. Isolation, secrecy, and control were markers to watch for, and any combination demanded attention. I noted their addresses, occupations, and travel patterns in a separate volume, one I kept hidden from public view. Knowledge, I had learned, was the only shield against the recurrence of horrors that men preferred to ignore. In June, news came from the surrounding counties of other disappearances and oddities. Nothing as overt as Piney Hollow, nothing with the stark clarity of 8 documented victims, yet there were patterns. Women traveling alone, routed through isolated areas, failing to return letters or correspondence. I sent discreet letters to local authorities, offering advice, tracing patterns, and suggesting vigilance. My efforts were met with polite acknowledgement but little action. Many preferred to dismiss the matter as coincidence, as chance, as misfortune. And yet, I knew better. The ledger had taught me that patterns could not be denied, that silence often concealed intent, and that evil had a way of persisting until it was named. I also revisited the records of the Mlin brothers' purchases and transactions. Rope, traps, barrels, and supplies had all been accounted for, yet the ledger also revealed subtler acquisitions: candles, lanterns, tools for digging, containers for storage. Each item, when traced against the timeline of arrivals and disappearances, illuminated the meticulous planning behind every act. Their preparation had been methodical, anticipatory, and devoid of empathy. They had approached murder as one approaches craftsmanship, and the ledger was the blueprint of their craft. My nights were often restless. I walked the streets of West Plains, noting shadows, listening to the wind through bare trees, and reflecting on the cost of vigilance. The ledger, my journal, and the accumulated evidence weighed heavily. The faces of the victims, young women full of hope and ambition, haunted my thoughts. Their letters, preserved in the Mlin journal, were a testament to trust misplaced, to innocence betrayed. Ada Kern, Sarah Dill, Constance Healy, Josephine Dale, Margaret Frost, and the others. 8 lives catalogued, 8 lives stolen, each reduced to a notation in a ledger, yet preserved in memory. In August, I received a letter from Ada Kern's father in St. Louis. He expressed gratitude, grief, and relief, writing that the knowledge of what had happened, though devastating, was preferable to the endless uncertainty that had followed her disappearance. He asked questions about the ledger, about the methods, about how I had discovered the truth, and I answered with the care of one conveying a grim history that must be remembered, but never glorified. His words reminded me that truth, when preserved, serves both the living and the dead, even if justice arrives through frost or fire rather than law. As the year progressed, I continued to monitor Piney Hollow and surrounding areas. The land had reclaimed much of the property, vines creeping over the charred remnants, wild grape and sumac obscuring the scars of human atrocity. Yet the hollow's memory remained, and I visited often, walking its perimeter, noting how the wind shifted, how shadows moved in the late afternoon, and how easily a traveler could be hidden from sight. Knowledge of geography, I realized, was as vital as knowledge of people, and both were necessary to prevent a repeat of the horrors I had witnessed. I also corresponded with a few trusted colleagues in neighboring counties, men and women in postal service, law enforcement, and education. I shared observations, advised on records keeping, and emphasized the importance of noting anomalies, letters unclaimed, patterns of delivery, and the subtle signs of unusual travel. The Mlin brothers had taught me that crime often lurked in the gaps of bureaucracy, in overlooked deliveries and unexamined entries, and that diligence, observation, and moral courage were the only defenses against it. By winter, 3 years had passé. Since the discovery in Piney Hollow, the hollow had quieted, families had mourned, and the town had moved forward with cautious memory. Yet I remained vigilant. The ledger had become not just a record but a sentinel, a repository of awareness, and I updated it daily. Each new arrival was noted, each pattern scrutinized, every letter, parcel, and route was catalogued with care, and the memory of the 8 women who had vanished guided every decision. Even in my later years, as my hair grayed and my steps slowed, I continued this work. The lessons of Piney Hollow were etched into my being. Evil hides in quiet places, and silence enables it. Vigilance is an act of duty, observation a moral imperative, and record-keeping a form of protection. The ledger, the journals, the maps, and the correspondence, all were instruments of remembrance, of accountability, and of defense. The Mlin brothers had fled into death, frozen and unrepentant, yet their legacy remained as a warning. The land remembered, the records remembered, and I, as postmaster and chronicler, remembered. The hollow would never be safe, nor would it be forgotten. But through observation, documentation, and moral courage, the ledger ensured that the horrors of Piney Hollow were not erased by time, ignorance, or fear. In the end, I understood that justice was not always served by law, and that evil often survives in the spaces between inaction and indifference. The ledger, my journals, and the careful chronicling of events became the true testament to what had occurred, preserving both the memory of the victims and the knowledge necessary to recognize and confront future darkness. And so I kept the books, counted the names, and recorded the patterns, knowing that vigilance is the only safeguard against the quiet horrors that wait in hidden hollows, and that someone must always keep watch. The years passed slowly after Piney Hollow, each season folding into the next, the hollow itself remaining an unspoken presence at the edge of town. I remained postmaster, keeping the ledgers with the same care as ever, my hands steady despite the passage of time, my eyes sharp for the patterns that might reveal danger before it arrived. The town continued its quiet routines, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, the shadow that had once lurked in its midst. Even in the everyday rhythms, reminders persisted. Travelers passing through still relied on the mail, on directions, on the small trust that strangers extend when isolated in the wilderness. And in those moments I remembered the women, the trust they had placed in the world, and the treachery that had met them. Ada Kern's father continued to write, expressing gratitude and sorrow, sharing the small details of a life forever altered by absence, and each letter became a reminder that even in the quietest acts, vigilance mattered. The ledger became more than a record of deliveries. It was a moral compass, a testament to the work required to keep darkness at bay. I continued to note every anomaly, every missed delivery, every unusual rote, and every traveler who moved alone through the hills. The townsfolk, for the most part, ignored my diligence. They called me eccentric, obsessed, a man haunted by ghosts. But ghosts are not always phantoms of the dead. They are warnings, echoes of the unseen, and I treated them as such. Occasionally, strangers asked about Piney Hollow, about the burned property, about the long-forgotten crimes that had once chilled the town. I answered with the barest of details, enough to convey caution without sensationalism. The hollow did not need stories to survive. Its memory was alive in the land itself, in the subtle depressions, in the way the wind moved through the trees, in the quiet absence of human presence. And I continued to visit, often alone, walking the perimeter, noting the changes, watching the land reclaim what had been desecrated, yet never forgetting the lives that had been stolen. In my later years, as the town modernized and the roads improved, I still observed. Mail continued to flow, travelers still came, and patterns still emerged. I kept the ledger updated daily, cross-referencing letters, deliveries, and movements, always vigilant, knowing that evil, even if dormant, waits for the moments when attention falters. I trained a few young clerks in the art of careful observation, teaching them not just to sort mail but to recognize anomalies, to record the unusual, to value precision as a form of protection. The Mlin brothers' names became a cautionary tale whispered quietly in town. Children were told to avoid Piney Hollow, to never trust strangers without confirmation, and to be mindful of the patterns that adults sometimes ignored. Parents remembered the women, the letters, and the journals, teaching lessons of caution, trust, and skepticism. Even as the town moved forward, the hollow retained its place in collective memory, not as a site of sensational horror, but as a quiet warning. I never married. I never sought companionship beyond the occasional conversation in town. My life became a life of observation, of record-keeping, of maintaining the ledger and the journals that would preserve the memory of those who could not speak for themselves. When I wrote entries, I did so with the precision and care I had learned in both war and postal service. Every date, every letter, every anomaly was accounted for, as if each notation were another act of protection, another act of justice. On the day the property was finally burned under court order, I watched from a distance. Flames consumed the cabin and barn, smoke curling into the sky, carrying with it both physical remnants and intangible residue. I wrote in my journal, the final entry of my long vigil, words as precise and deliberate as those in the ledger: case closed. Justice served. Let the record stand. Evil hides in quiet places, but the land remembers, and someone is always keeping the books. Even after the fire, the hollow retained its power. People avoided it, and nature continued its reclamation. Wild grape and sumac sprawled over charred earth, and the wind carried the silence in every direction. But I knew that memory, meticulous record-keeping, and vigilance were as crucial as fire or law. Without them, the shadow of what had occurred could return, unnoticed, until the next pattern of disappearance revealed itself. I died in 1911, at the age of 71, having served as postmaster until my final days. My journals and ledgers were left carefully catalogued and stored, a legacy of observation and moral diligence. I had counted names, traced patterns, and recorded the absences that others ignored. I had carried the weight of Piney Hollow so that others would not have to, and in doing so, I believed I had given the stolen women their measure of justice, if not the law's. The hollow remains to this day, overgrown and silent. Few venture there, fewer speak of it, and even the oldest residents now regard it with wary respect. Yet the land remembers. The patterns, the losses, and the traces of the Mlin brothers' crimes persist, etched in earth and memory alike, and the ledger, preserved and updated long after my death, continues its work, recording, observing, warning. Evil may hide in quiet places, but it cannot hide from meticulous attention, from the moral obligation to count the names and follow the evidence into darkness. In the end, the story of Piney Hollow is not just one of horror or crime. It is a story of duty, of vigilance, and of moral courage. It is a testament to the power of observation, to the necessity of record-keeping, and to the enduring responsibility to confront evil wherever it arises, no matter how quiet, no matter how hidden. And somewhere, in the silence of the hollow, the names of 8 women, and all those who might have followed, remain known, remembered, and honored by the one who kept the books. The land waits, silent, but not forgiving, and the ledger endures, a sentinel against the quiet darkness that lingers in hollows, in forests, and in the spaces that men choose to ignore. Someone must always keep watch. Someone must always remember. And so the hollow keeps its stories, the ledger keeps its record, and the lesson remains clear. Evil thrives where attention falters, and justice, though sometimes delayed, requires courage, persistence, and memory. The ledger, now fat with entries, weighed heavily on my desk, though the ink remained crisp and clear as if the paper itself understood its duty. I sat in the post office late into the night, oil lamps sputtering, winter wind rattling the window panes, and traced the patterns once more. Each name, each date, each delivery address formed a lattice of absence, a map of disappearance, and yet the townspeople remained comfortably blind to the truth. The hollow had a way of hiding its secrets, even from those who wished to see. It was early January of 1902 when I realized that the time for observation had ended. I could no longer remain a recorder of absence. The hollow demanded confrontation. The snow lay deep and white across the ridges, the roads frozen and nearly impassable, and yet I mounted my mare and rode toward the Mlin property with a resolve that had hardened over decades. The hollow awaited, dark and silent, a place where trust had been betrayed repeatedly, and where I intended to measure the full scope of its horrors. The cabin appeared at the end of its secluded lane, low and dark against the gray sky. Smoke from the chimney had long ceased, and the barn door sagged on its hinges, a half-hearted defense against time and neglect. My breath rose in clouds as I dismounted, leaving the mare tethered to a hickory sapling, and stepped onto the frozen yard. The air was sharp, cutting at my lungs, yet I did not hesitate. The ledger had prepared me, the records had spoken, and I was ready to confront the legacy of 8 lives stolen. Inside the cabin, the floorboards creaked under my boots. Dust and soot coated the surfaces, and the remnants of the brothers' life lay scattered in quiet disarray. The pegs were empty, no coats hung to mark the passage of travelers, and the fireplace held nothing but cold ashes. I moved through the room slowly, methodically, each step measured, my eyes scanning for the traces that might reveal the extent of their crimes. And then I saw it, the trapdoor in the corner of the barn, nearly hidden under a faded tarp. My heart quickened. This was the point at which absence became presence, where speculation became evidence. With crowbar in hand, I lifted the boards, each one protesting with the frozen wood, until a black void opened beneath me. The smell of earth and rot rose immediately, thick and almost tactile, and I forced myself to breathe steadily. The hollow below had not yet been disturbed. I lowered a lamp carefully, its light illuminating a stone-lined pit that descended deeper than I had imagined. And there, at the bottom, faint in the lamplight, were the shapes I had long feared, remnants of cloth, twisted forms that had once been human, the evidence of lives terminated in secrecy and silence. My hands shook, though I forced them steady to note what I saw. Trunks, carefully labeled, lay in shadow, as if the brothers had taken pride in their gruesome order. The initials carved into brass plates caught the light, names I had catalogued in the ledger, dates of arrival and disappearance, all recorded with methodical cruelty. Each trunk, each bundle, each carefully stacked heap represented a transaction, a life accounted for in terms of utility rather than human existence. My stomach churned, and yet my mind remained sharp. This was evidence, undeniable, and it demanded action. I returned to town and gathered Jacob Marsh, a man I had relied upon before, whose back was strong and whose discretion was unwavering. Together we returned to the hollow under the cover of a gray morning, shovels and crowbars in hand. The snow muffled our steps, the wind whispered through the trees, and the hollow waited, silent and patient. With each plank removed, the earth surrendered its secrets. Bodies, once buried and hidden, now revealed themselves in tragic stillness. Clothing, personal effects, letters, all preserved by the cold and the careful attention of murderers who had considered themselves meticulous. The work took hours, Each discovery compounded the horror, yet it confirmed the ledger's accuracy. 8 women lost to the hollow, each accounted for in the cold precision of record-keeping. Sarah Dill, Constance Healy, Josephine Dale, Margaret Frost, Ada Kern, and 3 others whose names I had uncovered in letters left behind. Each had traveled alone, each had been routed through the property, and each had vanished, leaving only the silent testimony of brass initials, worn letters, and careful burial. The scale of the crime became undeniable, concrete, and utterly horrifying. I documented everything with care, the way a scholar preserves artifacts, noting dates, conditions, and positions. The weight of what I recorded pressed upon me, yet I moved deliberately, aware that hesitation would dishonor those who had perished. For the first time I understood the full scope of the hollow's darkness, not merely in the acts themselves, but in the years of concealment, the townspeople's willful blindness, and the quiet complicity of the law. The ledger had been right, the hollow had been hiding evil, and the world had ignored the signs until now. By mid-afternoon, we had cleared the pit enough to see its depth fully. It was no shallow grave. It was a deliberate chamber of concealment, structured with intent and precision. The earth itself bore witness to the cold calculation of the brothers, their understanding of order and secrecy, and the moral void that permitted such acts over 8 years. I felt a mixture of vindication and despair. The ledger had spoken, and I had followed it into the hollow, but the cost, the weight of knowledge, was heavier than I had anticipated. I sat beside the pit for a time, rifle across my knees, watching the empty road and the silent trees. The wind moved through the branches with a sibilant whisper, as if the hollow itself were speaking, warning, reminding. The names of the women filled my mind, not as abstractions, but as real presences lost too soon. And yet there was clarity in the horror. I now held the proof that the townspeople and the law had refused to acknowledge. I had walked toward the darkness, and I had seen it fully. In that stillness, I realized the ledger was not merely a record of absence, but a tool of moral reckoning. Patterns mattered, diligence mattered, and attention to detail could make the difference between concealment and revelation. The hollow had hidden evil for years, but it could not hide from the combination of observation, record-keeping, and the will to act. I would see that this evidence reached those who needed to know, that the ledger's precision could finally enforce a measure of justice, even if only posthumously. As dusk approached, we sealed the pit temporarily, covering it with boards and snow, ensuring that the site remained undisturbed until proper authorities could arrive. Jacob and I rode back toward town in silence, the air cold against our faces, each step measured, each thought heavy. The ledger, now more than ever, felt like a living instrument, guiding action, preserving memory, and ensuring that the pattern I had traced was acknowledged, recorded, and acted upon. The hollow had revealed its secrets, 8 women accounted for at last, and yet the weight of the truth remained. I knew the law would act slowly, reluctantly, but the ledger would endure, as would my record of what had been discovered. The hollow might remain silent, but its history was now impossible to ignore, and the pattern that had once been invisible, to all but a watchful eye, had finally been brought to light. The next morning, the town awoke to the news that the hollow had yielded its secrets. Sheriff Hayes moved with cautious urgency, sending deputies to secure the Mlin property and arranging for proper equipment to excavate the well fully. I provided him with the ledger, the notes, and the journal I had recovered from Virgil and Ezra Mlin, all the records that traced the sisters, daughters, and travelers who had vanished over 8 long years. The sheriff's expression was unreadable as he examined the entries, each one a cold, methodical accounting of human life ended and hidden. The coroner arrived by midday, bringing with him instruments and assistants, and we returned to the pit to uncover the remains properly. Each body was lifted with care, wrapped, and catalogued alongside the personal effects that had survived, the years in cold storage beneath stone and earth. Ada Kern's letters, still intact though faded, were tied together in string, each one a silent testament to trust betrayed, hope extinguished, and the cruelty of men who believed themselves beyond consequence. The jewelry, a cameo brooch, and a silver ring, were recovered with the bodies, each a marker of identity and connection to those who waited anxiously in St. Louis and elsewhere. As the excavation continued, the full scale of the horror became undeniable. 8 women, each lost to the hollow in turn, each reduced to an entry in a ledger that had once seemed a mere record of routine, now revealed the careful orchestration of their disappearance. Sarah Dill, Constance Healy, Josephine Dale, Margaret Frost, Ada Kern, and 3 others whose names emerged from letters I had collected. The ledger had been accurate, the pattern irrefutable. Their lives, erased from memory and community, were now accounted for with evidence that could not be ignored. I watched as the coroner and deputies worked, cataloging each find, noting the condition, the positions, the personal items. Every detail reinforced the meticulous cruelty of the Mlin brothers, their capacity for order and concealment, and the townspeople's years-long blindness. The law had failed these women before, but now, confronted with undeniable physical evidence, it could no longer hide behind excuses of doubt or insufficient proof. Even Sheriff Hayes, who had dismissed my initial concerns, seemed shaken by the weight of the truth. His hands, once steady, now trembled slightly as he documented the findings, and his voice carried a rare note of solemnity when he addressed me. It's worse than I imagined," he said quietly, looking at the journal I held open. "You were right all along, every one of them." I nodded, though there was no triumph in it. Justice had arrived too late for the victims, but the ledger, my persistence, and the cold determination to follow patterns into darkness had ensured that their names would be remembered. The coroner confirmed the cause of death, exposure for the brothers, and the women's deaths had come swiftly once they were in the hollow, though the exact circumstances would never be known with certainty. The journal provided chilling insight into the brothers' methodical approach, each woman treated as an object, each disappearance timed, each burial executed with precision. After the bodies were removed and the site secured, I returned to town to draft formal notifications to the families. Each letter carried the weight of loss, the acknowledgement of years of silence, and the truth that the law had been absent when it mattered most. Ada Kern's father received his letter with trembling hands, clutching the final correspondence from his daughter that had survived in the cold earth. He read it aloud in a small service at the Methodist church, his voice breaking over words that spoke of hope and trust, and I stood in the back, silent, as tears welled in my eyes. For each family, the ledger had restored what had been denied to them: knowledge, recognition, and the solemn acknowledgement of the lives that had been stolen. The Mlin property was not left to stand. By order of the county, every structure was dismantled and burned. The cabin, barn, and outbuildings were soaked in lamp oil and set ablaze, flames consuming wood that had sheltered horrors for 8 years. Everything movable had been removed beforehand: traps, tools, furniture, and artifacts of the brothers' life. The fire was more than practical, it was symbolic, a cleansing of a place tainted by cruelty, a reckoning that law could not fully deliver, but nature, human persistence, and ritual could. As the smoke rose and the hollow filled with the smell of burning timber, I felt a strange mixture of closure and emptiness. The ledger had preserved memory, the fire had erased the place, and the law had reluctantly acknowledged truth. The land, once complicit in silence, now bore witness to action and accountability. However delayed, the hollow would never be safe, never forgotten, but its secrets were no longer hidden, and the ledger remained a record of what had been done, what had been lost, and what had been discovered through patience, observation, and the refusal to look away. Winter softened as February progressed. The valley lay quiet under snow, the hollow overgrown with sumac and wild grape, a place avoided, whispered about only in cautious tones. I continued my work at the post office, updating ledgers, recording arrivals and departures, keeping the books as others kept prayers, knowing that diligence in small acts could preserve memory, ensure accountability, and remind the living that evil exists where silence prevails. The ledger had been more than a record. It had been a guide, a moral compass, and a weapon against those who would hide in plain sight. In the years that followed, the hollow remained untouched. No one built there, no hunter dared disturb it, and the memory of 8 lives lost became both a caution and a monument. I continued my duties as postmaster, maintaining records with precision, preserving correspondence with the same care I had applied to uncovering the Mlin crimes. The ledger, and my journals documenting the investigation, became a silent guardian of truth, a reminder that attention, vigilance, and persistence can uncover what others ignore. When I finally left the world in 1911, At the age of 71, the ledger and the journals remained behind, preserved in the post office where they could be referenced, studied, and remembered. I never married. I never spoke publicly about the Mlin brothers except when duty required it. But my final entry, made on the day the Mlin property was burned, captured the essence of what I had learned, what I had endured, and what I had preserved. Case closed, justice served, let the record stand. Evil hides in quiet places, but the land remembers, and someone is always keeping the books. And so it stands, a testament to the power of observation, the importance of records, and the consequences of indifference. The hollow waits still, grown over and silent, but it carries memory in the soil, in the stones, and in the ledger. Those who vanished are no longer absent in truth, and those who hid in shadows are finally counted, catalogued, and remembered, not through trial, not through law, but through vigilance, diligence, and the unyielding act of keeping the books. The weeks after the excavation passed with a strange quiet settling over Howell County. The Mlin property had been burned, the well emptied and reburied, and the hollow slowly returned to its natural silence, though the weight of what had happened there lingered in the air, heavy and almost tangible. Townspeople avoided the area, muttering under their breath when its name came up, eyes flicking toward the hills, as if the wind itself might carry reminders of the horror. I kept my post at the Howell County post office, tending to letters and parcels with the Sam. Care as before, but now every piece of correspondence carried the unspoken knowledge that evil can hide in quiet places, and that one person's diligence can force truth into the light. Sheriff Hayes never spoke of the Mlin brothers again, at least not publicly. He continued his rounds with a cautious reserve, the incident leaving him quieter, more measured. The deputies who had helped at the well occasionally exchanged glances when the hollow was mentioned, but the town collectively moved forward as best it could, burying the memory in daily routines. Only the families of the women remembered fully, clinging to the fragments of letters, jewelry, and journals that documented lives stolen and then restored to memory. Their grief was immense, tempered only slightly by the knowledge that the truth had been revealed. I continued to ride the roads around Piney Hollow, making note of the mail deliveries, the routes, and the people who traveled through the county. Every entry into my ledger, every note in my journal, became a small act of vigilance, a way to ensure that no other pattern of violence could go unnoticed. The weight of what I had discovered, the knowledge of the ledger, the journal, and the frozen bodies in the cave, never left me. It became part of my daily routine, part of the rhythm of my life, like the tick of the post office clock or the feel of ink on paper. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind cut through the town streets, I would ride to the ridge above Piney Hollow and look down into the valley. The hollow was overgrown now, the earth scarred and quiet, but I could feel the history embedded in the soil, the echo of lives lost and remembered. I imagined the women, their voices silenced too soon, and I whispered their names one by one as though the act could restore a fraction of the dignity stolen from them. I would remember them in my ledger, in my journals, and in my mind, a solemn duty to honor what the law had ignored. The ledger itself became a sacred object, not merely a record of arrivals and departures, but a testament to vigilance and moral duty. I updated it daily, not out of obsession, but out of recognition that each name counted, each letter mattered, and that in the absence of attention, silence could nurture danger. I learned to trust patterns, to notice the small inconsistencies, and to follow them even when others dismissed them as coincidence. The Mlin brothers were a cautionary tale, a reminder that meticulous evil can flourish where attention is scarce and authority reluctant. In the later years of my life, I often thought about the notion of justice. The Mlin brothers had died without trial, their bodies frozen in a cave far from the law, but the ledger, the letters, and the journal had become instruments of accountability. Families received closure, the hollow bore witness, and I, an ordinary postmaster, had become a custodian of memory, proving that diligence, courage, and the refusal to look away can matter even when the world prefers ignorance. I never married. I never sought recognition. My life was quiet, filled with the rhythm of deliveries and the careful recording of names and dates. But the ledger, now thick with entries spanning decades, remained a monument to those I could not protect in life, but whose stories I could preserve in ink. It was not enough to catch criminals. It was necessary to ensure that history remembered their deeds and the lives they took. On the day I finally wrote my last entry, I was 71 years old, my hands trembling slightly but my mind clear. The ledger was complete, the journals updated, and the hollow once again silent. I wrote simply, "Case closed, justice served, let the record stand. Evil hides in quiet places, but the land remembers and someone is always keeping the books." I laid down my pen, closed the journal, and felt a deep sense of duty fulfilled. Not perfect justice, not legal vindication, but moral certainty, the knowledge that the record had been preserved, and that the truth had been acknowledged. When I passed in 1911, the ledger and the journals remained behind in the post office, preserved for posterity. They were not trophies, nor were they public declarations, but archives of vigilance, proof that careful observation, patience, and moral courage could uncover the truth even when the law refused to act. Scholars, townspeople, and family members would come later to read the pages, and the memory of the Hollow, the Mlin brothers, and the women they had killed would endure, not as rumor, not as whisper, but as documented history, undeniable and immutable. The Hollow itself grew quiet over time. Trees and shrubs overtook the paths, the creek carried water silently past the old cabin site, and wildlife reclaimed the land. But memory remained embedded in the soil, and anyone who traveled near it could feel the weight of what had transpired there. It was a place where evil had once flourished, but vigilance had prevailed, and so long as someone kept the books, as I had done, the record would endure, and the silent lives lost would not be forgotten. And that is the story of the Mlin brothers, the Hollow, the ledger, and the Postmaster who refused to look away. It is a story not just of horror, but of persistence, of moral duty, and of the understanding that even in the quietest places, someone must bear witness. Records matter, memory matters, and when evil hides, it is the work of the vigilant to uncover it, name it, and ensure it is remembered. The Hollow may still stand, grown over and silent, but its story lives on in ink, in paper, and in the steadfast heart of the one who kept the books.